Why I chose to be homeless at 13. Warning, warning sign, this is about child abuse of all kinds. My very first memory of my mother was of her choking on her own vomit in the back bedroom of my grandparents' house. I was still really young, maybe 5 or 6. She'd been out drinking and partying with her loser biker friends, according to the conversation I heard between my grandparents. They'd walked her drunk ass back there to sleep it off and had told me to let her sleep. I did. I left her alone for hours before my curiosity got the better of me and I snuck down the hallway to listen to her from outside the door. I'll never ever forget hearing her snore. I remember feeling glad. My grandfather, who I called Pop, had told me to leave her alone because she was really tired. And I had, for hours, but damn, I wanted to know what was going on. So, while they got into the news on TV, I snuck down the hall to listen through her door. It was luck or serendipity or fate that day. As I heard her snoring, I remember being glad she was getting sleep. The innocent child mind was not yet broken by her. It was when she started making a different noise that I got worried. It sounded bad, so I slowly and quietly opened the door. She had vomited while laying on her back. The thick fluid was caked all around her nose and mouth. I remember the big bubble in her nostril growing and shrinking with her breathing. I remember her body starting to shake. I remember crying out from fear and my grandma rushing to help. That's why, later, when I heard my grandparents talking about how I saved her life, I felt proud. I had saved her from choking to death. I really came to regret that in the following years, but that night I remember feeling like a hero. My parents were only 19 when I was born. That was in 1982. My mom and dad then spent the next 10 years or so living their best life. Drinking and partying and leaving me with her parents. And life for me was good and mostly stable. My grandparents loved me very much. Out of their 6 kids, they'd only had one son, who spent his whole life on drugs and going in and out of jail. I think my grandparents thought of me as their second chance son. I didn't know it at the time, but my grandma herself had a plethora of mental health issues. From a hidden alcoholism, to depression, and an unfortunate condition of pathological lying. I just knew Grandma told the best stories. Every night before bed she'd tell me the most vivid and detailed stories. From pirates looking for treasures to ghost stories, her tales were so engaging. I'll never forget her telling me about Bloody Mary or Black Aggie, a local tale of a woman who died and haunted the graveyard where she'd been buried. If she wasn't up for a homemade story, she'd let me pick a book and she would read it to me. Any book. That's why I was so young and in love with Stephen King. Her reading me Pet Sematary is a core memory, and really unlocked a lifelong love of reading. She'd even do different voices depending on what character was speaking, a habit I picked up when reading to my own kids decades later. Up until age 10, I had bedtime stories and midnight snacks and a routine and love from my grandparents. My mom was still busy living her narcissistic bullshit apart from me. I lived in blissful ignorance of her, except for the random times she would sober up enough for my grandparents to let her stay with us intermittently. I never had her around much. Then one day my grandma's mental health really started to decline. Her depression worsening, her drinking really stepped up. I remember finding little empty liquor bottles in a cupboard in the basement and showing my grandfather. I remember the fight they had later too. I'll never forget waking up the next morning to my grandfather sitting on the end of my bed crying. "Your grandma left us, Bubba," he told me. He only used my nickname when I was in trouble, and I remember feeling responsible for finding the empty bottles she'd been hiding. "It's just gonna be me and you now. I'm going to need your help now. You're going to have to be a big boy for Pop." That morning I watched him sadly make us French toast. It had uncooked egg on one side of the toast, but I said nothing and ate it anyway. Watching that man, who'd never cooked for me before, fuck up something as simple as French toast, broke my fucking heart. He was trying. A little while later, I find out my mom's fallen in love. I met him, Mark. He's not one of those losers she's used to. He's got a good job and works hard. He even got your mom a job. And she wants to come see you so you can meet him. My grandfather told me one morning. I remember dreading it. Up to that point, a visit from my mother meant chaos. Drunk and crying or fighting. A disruptive event. I had no idea how bad it was going to be. My mother was in love. His name was John and I got a bad feeling from him right away. I cried and cried when Pop told me that I would be going to stay with him soon. Just for a little while, just till he got used to life without my grandma. She'd just run out on me and I wouldn't know it for a while. But she just decided one morning to go to a homeless shelter and never come back to her family. Mom had a new man and was anxious to play house with me too. I'll never forget that first night in their house. The yellow, nicotine-stained walls. The dog hair covering everything. The smells of stale beer and cigarettes and dog shit send me right back there to this day. She'd been on her best behavior for Pop. She didn't even start drinking until we got to their house, which seemed to be hours away by car from Pop's house. It was a long drive out into the woods. The house was on a quiet street with neighbors not far away on each side. Pretty on the outside but all fucked up inside. It was an outward extension of my mother. I was initially scared and sad, but there was a tree house in the front yard and John had spent the drive promising me that his 3 sons would be around soon for me to play with. I had no idea yet that his oldest son would be my molester. I spent the first day outside, exploring the woods and the street we lived on. Meeting other kids up the road, getting the lay of the land. I spent the first night in my room with headphones on, listening to the last cassette my grandma had left me in an attempt to drown out the loud, drunken sex going on just down the hall. They didn't even close their fucking door. I would have to get used to that. John hit me the first time the next morning. They were both hungover and I woke him up accidentally while asking my mom if I could get some breakfast. It was already around noon, and I had gotten used to eating early with my grandfather by then. He smacked me in the face right there in front of my mother. She told me I better start behaving because John wouldn't let me do whatever I want like Pop does. The fear and depression of knowing it was my life now is something I don't have words for. My stability was broken. My world was destroyed. My grandparents had abandoned me. Looking back now from the future, one of the saddest parts for me is knowing how quickly I got used to the abuse. I learned to be gone or invisible while they drank all evening after work. And to tiptoe around all morning while they were hungover and bitchy. To trying to find a friend's house to stay at while they fought each other. How to lie to the social worker who'd occasionally show up due to the neighbors calling the cops on them. Or lying about the bruises to my teachers. After the first year of that, John's sons came to stay with us for a summer. He had lost custody of them, small wonder, and their mother had fled with him to Florida, far away from his house in Maryland. But, like my mother, John would go through phases where he'd want to be a father and fight the courts to see them. His need to parent wouldn't last long, but it'd lead to them coming up every summer to stay with us. I hated it immediately. They'd take my room. I'd be sent to sleep in the cold and damp unfinished basement while John's oldest son Samuel took my room. His other sons got the spare room to share. Before they started coming up from Florida, I used to look forward to them drinking and passing out in that spare room. They had 2 computers in there and they'd stay up after work drinking and playing a NASCAR game until they passed out. I loved it because it meant I could sneak into the kitchen and steal something to eat. My mother was always telling me how fat I was and how my pop should never have let me eat so much. They put any easy to prepare food in a couple cupboards that stayed locked. When they'd pass out in the back room I could have time to get the locks open and eat something. I was always hungry because my mother was very inconsistent with feeding me. When she did cook, she'd make me eat at the kitchen table while they sat in the living room watching TV. She'd plop my plate down in front of me and say, "Here's your piggy portion." I still have issues with eating to this day. I can't even eat in a restaurant because I became so used to sneaking off with food to eat alone that I feel terrible anxiety eating in public. John really only liked his eldest son Sam. Probably because he was just as shitty as his father. Loud and dumb, where the other 2 were quiet and reserved. Sam waited a week before he started creeping down to the basement at night to fuck with me. The first time waking up to an erection slapping my mouth I cried and cried, but even that just made me numb eventually. Nobody would have believed me so I said nothing. I was very embarrassed just thinking about it, so I didn't. It would only come out in my nightmares later. That's what I got used to. Summers of molestation. Winters where my mother's bipolar disorder made her depression worse, drinking worse, and the abuse really intensified. I'd spend so much time at my friend Ben's house down the street that his dad would joke about charging me rent. I think he knew why I was there so much, though, and he didn't really mind my presence. On the outside I was still a good kid. It took an outside perspective to really make me grasp how bad my life had become. The day my friend Alan came over, I knew they'd be working late that night, as they'd been bitching about it all week, so I thought it would be a good time to bring a friend over to show them my video games. The one good thing about John was he made a lot of money, and spent lavishly on his sons when they'd visit. All those expensive toys would then be left for me to play with once they went home. And I was dying to play Super Nintendo with a friend instead of playing with no volume by myself like usual. Which is what we were doing when I heard the front door open and my mom screaming about me leaving a bike on the front porch. She was doing her usual screaming freakout and I could see the fear plainly on Alan's face. He had a normal life, and a mother screaming obscenities at him wasn't something he'd had to deal with. I whispered to him to hide in my closet, and he did. I was not allowed to have friends over and I was terrified of what she'd do to him. She was great at pretending to be normal to others. It was only at home the mask came off. She rushed to my room screaming about leaving the bike Alan's, but she had no clue on the porch. Was I trying to make her break her neck coming up the steps to her own damn house, etc. She wasn't wearing a belt, so she grabbed a spatula on her way to my room to beat me with. The metal spatula was much worse, and I was soon crying and shaking and snotting all over. Then it was over. She'd left to go to the liquor store with John. When I opened my closet and saw Alan's face, I had an epiphany. I saw it so clearly. This was not normal. Just normal for me. And I was done. I walked Alan home and just went out in the woods by myself. I thought about all the CPS visits. All the midnight gropings. All the beatings and abuse. I was done. I decided that couch surfing through the remainder of school was infinitely better. I could do it. I had made friends. So I did. It took a month for them to really notice I hadn't been home at all. She didn't report me missing though. She didn't want me brought back. She wanted to punish me for leaving. That's why I got arrested my first week into 6th grade. That's when my good kid reputation was blown to hell. Having the fire marshal handcuff me in class really did it. He wouldn't even tell me what I'd done until he had me in the back of his police truck. He told me I'd be going to jail for trying to burn my mom's house down. That's what she'd cooked up apparently. I sat in the J. Dewey's Carter Youth Facility for 3 months. My first night I was stuck in a cell with a monster named Richard Frizzell, who I later found out had raped his infant sister. I spent that night huddled in a corner as he openly masturbated. That place was hell of a different kind, but that's another story. Luckily for me, the friend I had been staying with knew what happened to me and what I had been going through, and his parents weren't about to let me rot in there forever. Their family friend was a really good lawyer, and he took my case pro bono. I didn't even know that there were people fighting for my release. It would have made those dark lonely nights bearable. But as soon as my case got before a judge, it was dismissed due to lack of evidence. I'm sure the phone book-sized CPS file helped out too. And that's what leads to my emancipation. My life got slowly better as I learned to deal with my past. It had its ups and downs, but overall I felt truly free for a long time after.